Hey, Thrilling Suspense fanatics. It was a pleasure and a joy to bring to you the Colossus of Yulorn. Now, this is the first of 2 sequels to the Colossus of Yulorn that we will listen to here on the channel. I've put them into a chronological sequence for you to enjoy. The theme in this one is subtle, and we also get to hear from Luc Le Chardonnier, who is a character featured in another Averoigne tale, The Beast of Averoigne, which this tale kind of serves as a sequel to both the Colossus of Yulorn and the Beast of Averoigne, giving us characters from both. It's with great pleasure that I bring to you Unhallowed Ground, Unholy Flesh by James Chambers, also from the Edward Stashif collection, The Averoigne Legacy. Let's get into it.
In those fear-blasted days of winter, Isobel's parting words haunted him more than the dread monstrosity that rose up to threaten the land of Averoigne. Many a night he passed dozing, bathed in the carmine glow of a dying fire as the mists of his memory swirled about and chilled him like a tempest of dreams. Some nights ill visions of the deepest corruptions visited him, and the shadows of his modest chamber writhed like serpents coiling to strike, agitated by the unconscious stirrings of his great power. In these black hours he would start to wakefulness at the sensation of some nearing entity, some form devoid of all the warmth of life, some mindless demiurge entreated with his apprehension. And though his countless sorcerous attempts to divine the nature of the thing had failed to unveil it, knowledge of its cause dwelled deep within his heart, waiting for the moment when he would allow himself to recognize it. On one of these spectre-branded nights, a heavy pounding dispelled the gathering storms of his consciousness and threw him awkwardly from troubled slumber. Shivering and sleep-addled, the solitary mage passed through darkened chambers, threw back the bar, and swung wide the stout door of his home. "The hour is quite late, and the winter air is savage and sharp," he said. "Who comes through such unpleasantness to disturb my reverie?" 2 men shuffled into the meager warmth of the entryway, one a broad-shouldered figure of taut muscle and sinew with a crossbow slung across his shoulders, and the other man of slight build but possessed of a steely posture. The flickering of the wizard's taper brought their visages into gentle focus, the scarred and hardened face of a warrior beside the soft, careless aspect of a monk. "I am Brother Albert," said the cleric. "With me is Henri Giraud, the Marshal of Villon. We seek Luc Le Chardonnier with word from the Archbishop of Villon." "And what does His Holiness wish of me?" said Le Chardonnier. "Though our interruption may be unseemly, sir, we have traveled the better part of a day to arrive here. We are frozen to the marrow," Brother Albert said. "Enter, enter," said the wizard with obvious exasperation. Le Chardonnier shut the door firmly, and then led his guests to his study. He threw fresh wood on the fire, and poured the men portions of potent brandy to restore the color to their flesh. As the remnants of sleep fell away, he grew more even-tempered and welcoming of the diversion that had rescued him from his nightly torment. What could bring to his door men such as these, who under most circumstances would shun him? 10 years had passed since his brief and secret discourse with the abbot of Perigon, when, in return for a service only he could provide, he had received dispensation from the Archbishop of Villon to carry on his arcane studies and occult explorations with impunity from the region's religious authority. Since then, the Church's periodic inquisitions against those of Le Chardonnier's calling had steered wide and far of the mage. As if reading his host's thoughts, Brother Albert resumed his purpose. "His Holiness wishes me first to remind you of the great service you provided some 10 years hence in dispelling the comet-spawned beast that ravaged Averoigne." The sorcerer nodded. "Of course." He noted in particular your discretion in attending to the reputation of Abbot Théophile, whose life was forfeit in that misadventure, and to this day is remembered for his good works rather than his ignominious demise. Yes, yes, said La Chardronniere. Whatever your god may give you cause to think of me and my work, Averoigne is my home. I want the best for it, and I am willing always to aid in its protection. Without one of my knowledge and power, the dark forces that haunt this land would surely overrun your congregation. Henri Giraud chose then to break his silence. His coarse, gravelly tone boomed in the close surroundings. No wizard have I ever met with such noble intentions. You would do well to realize that there are those who wonder if your affection for Averoigne is not fostered by a wish to guard some secret purpose. Many feel that seeking the aid of your kind is akin to consorting with the devil. I am aware, Marshal Giraud, of all that is said of me. Rumor and jealousy must surround all those who follow my path, deserved or not. What is it your archbishop would have of me? Evading the direct question, Albert continued, His Holiness also asked me to offer his continued assurance of immunity for your studies and work. Is it blackmail, then? Said La Chardronniere. Consent to his request or face trial by torture? No, please don't misunderstand, said Albert. His Holiness is an honorable man and wishes only to reconfirm your status. In exchange for your cooperation in this current matter, he is prepared to grant reburial on hallowed ground of the Scotswoman Isobel Eichmann, dead by her own hand these past 8 months. Le Chardronniere toppled into the high-backed chair he kept by the hearth. An icy sensation seized his weary figure, and he found no words with which to respond. With numb fingers he clutched the nearby brandy decanter and poured himself a full measure. The amber liquid revived his senses and brought tears brimming to his eyes. The Archbishop is aware of your dispute in this cause with the Bishop of Zim and has made arrangements to assure his colleague will not interfere. The wizard leaned forward, his narrow gaze searching the monk's features for signs of guile, but finding none. What is it he would have of me? He whispered. You are familiar, I assume, with Nathair's Plain, Albert said. It is a patch of land along the banks of the Issoil, a wasteland not far from Villon, said to be the final resting place of the dwarfish necromancer Nathair and his 10 devil-given pupils. Its soil is poisoned and fit nurture for only the vilest of plants and fungi. The water that passes there, beneath the hollow remains of its once strident pines, often becomes polluted. For nearly a century the land has been left undisturbed by men, but in recent weeks travelers on the high wooded road have glimpsed flames of bonfires on the river's bank in the night. They have heard the faint discordant echoes of voices carrying through the lifeless woods. The Archbishop sent 2 monks from my abbey to investigate. 3 days later, their bodies washed ashore downriver. Their bones had been crushed near to powder. Since then, several head of livestock have been found in similar condition among the farms outlying Villon, and a number of barns and other structures have been demolished. Whatever wreaks this destruction draws closer to the city with each new slaughter. His Holiness fears the worst for Villon and implores your kindness in directing your expertise to solving this mystery and mayhaps saving many lives. Le Chardronniere tested the monk's tale against what he knew of Nathair's Plain and the history of the dread necromancer. He was more familiar with the story than Albert suspected, having visited the plain on more than one occasion to secure certain rare alchemical ingredients that grew exclusively in such forsaken places. The land there did indeed suffer the miasma of impenetrable evil. It suffused the soil and girded the air, and Le Chardronniere conducted his business there in haste so as not to fall prey to its unhealthy influence. He had often concluded that one who set foot upon such benighted ground in the wrong frame of mind would be easy victim for lingering malice. If you agree, we are to provide you with what supplies and men you might require, and escort you to the river Issoil, said Brother Albert. With or without you, we must return to the road at dawn, Giraud said, and I would take some measure of rest while night is still upon us. What say you, sir? The mage rose from his seat and showed his visitors his back. He peered into the hungry flames beyond the hearth. Amber, iridescent embers swirled and floated into nothingness. Isabel, for all her exploration of things occult and mysterious, had never fully relinquished the faith of her birthright. With her body interred on holy ground, might her tortured soul finally know peace? If a chance existed, Le Chardonnier must take it. "I am at your service. You may rest here while I prepare," he said. "I will need a little, but I must consult my archives and resources. Do not leave this room. Ignore whatever sounds or voices you may hear. We three are the only men present, regardless of what your senses might tell you. You will be safe under my protection. Follow my instructions, and we shall leave at first light. Any interruption will perhaps prove unhealthy for us all and delay us. Agreed?" Albert and Giraud traded questioning glances, then nodded in consent. "We shall remain here and await your summons," Albert said. With that, the monk knelt directly before the fire. The heat drew beads of perspiration from his bald pate as he clasped his hands about a rosary and settled into quiet prayer. The marshal poured himself a fresh dram of brandy and eased into his chair to count the long, slow hours. But neither man passed the time in restful repose. The horrific cries and unearthly howls emanating from the deepest recesses of the dwelling fueled their wakefulness and unease until daybreak. An hour before sunrise, gentle snow began to fall. The wind settled into a steady blow that kept up without quarter and stole the rider's warmth. The trio encountered few signs of life along their journey. Le Chardonnier viewed this absence as a bad omen, and the gathering blackness on the western horizon only reinforced the sense of hopelessness gnawing at the back of his mind. His nocturnal investigations, which he had hoped would arm him with useful knowledge, had served only to deepen his puzzlement and consternation. Giraud rode ahead, a stain against the deepening intensity of the snow-clad forest land as he marked the trail and set the pace. Brother Albert drew aside Le Chardonnier and attempted to enjoin him in conversation. The mage had little to say, but the monk expounded at length of his monastery and his Cistercian brothers, of their long history and tradition in the region, and of the ruined remains of the castle of Yolorne, which stood above their cloisters in the deepening woods. The young cleric possessed a worldliness uncharacteristic of his years, and the few times he succeeded in engaging his companion, he demonstrated a knowledge and facility that extended well beyond the traditional realms of his religion. "You've a surprisingly open mind," Le Chardonnier said. "This is Averoigne, my friend, where a closed mind can lead to a sure death," Albert said. "Besides, the abbot's library is among the finest in the land. I believe you have underestimated me and my brethren." By noon, they came upon a small camp at a fork in the road where 3 men-at-arms huddled around a sputtering fire that demanded their constant attention amidst the swift wind and downy precipitation. At the rider's approach, the men rose and readied their weapons, but at a sign from Giraud, they gladly sheathed them again. What orders the marshal gave his men were lost on the intervening wind, but when Le Chardonnier and the monk reached the campsite, the fire had been doused and the soldiers had mounted their steeds. "You say you have all you need for your investigation, Monsieur Chardonnier," Giraud called to the mage. "But with these 3 men at my side, I would brave the gates of Lucifer's domain. They travel with us whether it suits you or not." Le Chardonnier assessed the fighting men, their coarse bearing and bodies toughened by rough lives. Love of honor burned in their deep-set eyes. They would do all within their power to secure their good standing with their leader and with their God. "Their presence is of no weight to me," he said after a moment. "They will not interfere. Let them attend and test their souls against Nathair's plain." The afternoon passed without measure. The sky grew uniform and coal dark. Clouds swirled like silt stirred from a river bottom by mad currents, and though light sometimes slipped through, none among the riders could determine the location of the sun or mark its passage. The snow continued to descend and coated the woods with inch upon inch of accumulation. It was only Guiraud's masterful scouting that enabled them to find their way. Even with good fortune, they would not achieve Nether's plain before nightfall, which meant passing hours camped on the edge of the most polluted land Les Chaudronniers had ever known. The idea brought him no comfort. But they would have little choice. To enter the plain by dark would be the sheerest stupidity. The riders knew they had begun their descent into the valley of the Issoile when the road embarked along a circuitous decline. What scant speech they had shared ceased as they neared the river. A thick mist drifted up to them, spawned by the dank unseen waters below. It floated in patches and mingled with the snow to form a tattered veil that obscured their surroundings. The steady thumping of their horses' hooves grew muted and dull in the shroud of weather. The quietude embraced them like a sleeping lover. Through the stillness came a horrible and unexpected cry, penetrating the thick atmosphere with the power of a hot needle. It rose from the trees, wild but human, pregnant with mourning and anger, and announced the presence of others approaching around the bend in the road ahead of them. Guiraud drew his stallion to a halt and waved for the riders to fall in close to the side of the road. They complied, their bodies weary from travel and their lungs seared by the relentlessly cold air. They shivered with the wetness that had finally suffused even the deepest layers of their clothing, to mingle with the cold perspiration of their bodies, and they watched. From past the edge of the hilly outcropping appeared a trio of ragged peasants, two of them dragging the remains of what had once been a wide, sturdy cart. Les Chaudronniers identified them as two men, both with streaks and splotches of blood smeared on their faces and clothing, and a somewhat less blood-stained woman. The males tugged the fractured wagon along its two front wheels while the woman straggled beside them, wailing her grief to the uncaring wilderness. "Stay where you are," bellowed the marshal. He raised his crossbow and drew it taut. The frightened peasants obeyed. Guiraud marched forward and identified himself. Fatigue and discomfort had worn away his temper until his impatience crackled in his voice. Les Chaudronniers could tell the marshal would not long brook the silence the peasants returned to his questioning demands. The mage coaxed his mount forward just as the marshal's anger reached its breaking point. "Can't you see their wits have deserted them?" he said. "How can they be expected to answer to your dogging when they've barely got hold of their senses?" Les Chaudronniers produced a flask and handed it to the eldest male with a warm invitation to drink. The liquid recalled the old man's wits in moments. Crimson patches burned flush in his face, and he swallowed another gulp before returning the container. Steadied by the draught, he attempted to explain the predicament of his family, but though his words came forth in coherent speech, what he spoke of only deepened the sheath of mystery that enveloped them all. The family had set forth 3 days ago with a cartload of charcoal, hoping to reach the gates of La Fresnaye while the weather held, but the snow had come quicker than anticipated and forced them to tarry along the stretch of road that paralleled Nether's plain. For a time they became lost when the road vanished into the mists. Some hours later they discovered their proper route, but barely had they set foot upon it when disaster assailed them. The sky above gathered into the form of a pale titanic arm, raised a mighty fist, and plummeted through the hazy air to slam thunderously onto their wagon, killing their young daughter who slept there. What coal escaped being turned to dust by the blow erupted through the air, striking the old man and his son, and scattering out of sight among the snowdrifts. The gargantuan hand then seized their workhorses and crushed them in its palm, spewing blood and pulped horse flesh in all directions. A cascade of demonic laughter shook the earth, then the thing vanished. Stillness returned but for the woman's tears, and the men had seized up their damaged cart and fled. The man spoke in the tones of an automaton, his mind able to produce a record of what he had experienced, but at the same time incapable of comprehending it. At hearing the tale recounted, the woman fell to her knees, her body racked with fresh waves of sorrow. Brother Albert, who had drawn near for the telling, dismounted and helped her to her feet, whispering prayers in her ear. He pressed a small crucifix into her open palm and bid her put her faith in the Lord, who watched over them all, and who surely now watched over her daughter. Some small composure restored her. The woman took her place beside her husband and son, and the family carried on along the fast disappearing road. Before the peasants left, the riders gave them a share of their provisions to carry them through the night. It was meager succor for such broken souls, and most likely a futile kindness. La Chardonnière had seen a dull madness gleaming in their eyes. The peasant's story bolstered some of the mage's worst expectations, but he elected not to give them voice until he found certainty. He read concern in Brother Albert's eyes, and knew the monk gave far more credence to the old man's account than their martial escort. The men-at-arms had already shrugged off the tale as madness, and made ample folly of it, once the shattered family went on their way. Giraud carried on, his expression equivocal, his attitude dismissive. It was an improvident mixture with which to face unknown evils, but Le Chardonnière had known far darker moments in his time. Further along the road, the riders encountered a meager hillside cove that offered reasonable shelter, and so they chose to camp there for the night. Crepuscular gloom gave way to full darkness, and the men scrambled to clear the ground and gather suitable fuel for their fire. Le Chardonnière was grateful to go no further, for even here he could feel the black energy of Nether's plane probing at his soul. Its power had grown since he had last traveled here, and its influence had spread outward. The night to come would be a difficult one, and their simple stores, which only satisfied their growling stomachs, did nothing to fortify them for the ordeal. They set watches at intervals with 2 men to share each duty. In the morning they planned to descend to the plain, though the thickening snow threatened to trap them should it continue without pause. Le Chardonnière and Brother Albert took the first watch, while the men-at-arms went quickly to sleep within the small shelter they had constructed. Giraud sat upon a high boulder, protected from the wind, enravelled in his thoughts, and intent upon staying awake until morning. Brother Albert passed the time seeking conversation. Le Chardonnière resisted, but even his stony silence and cold stares failed to dissuade the earnest monk. Thus Albert spoke at length of his monastery, where he found all the needs of his existence fulfilled by a simple life of austerity and contemplation. Trouble, he explained to the disinterested mage, did not avoid the monastery. Conflict came to their community just as any other, but all things were resolved after a fashion. Tragedy did not leave them unattended, as their long history in Averoigne attested, or even events as recent as Brother Garamon's vanishing a month before while carrying communications between the archbishop and the monastery. No doubt fallen prey to the vampires and spectres of Averoigne, Albert said, but tell me, Messire Le Chardonnière, what is the tale of Isabel Eichmann? Was she your wife, your lover? Why might one so young take her own life? Fool! Le Chardonnière spat. What would you know of it? You live life protected by your God, shielded by your meaningless optimism. A monk lost in the woods is your concept of tragedy. How dare you question the life of one beautiful beyond words in both form and spirit? Brother Albert mumbled an entreaty for forgiveness, then fell silent. Le Chardonnière saw genuine embarrassment in the monk's eyes, his words born only of the thoughtless inquisitiveness of youth, and he looked somewhat more kindly upon his companion. Isabel was my student, then my friend, and finally my lover. She came here because those in her homeland, even her closest family, hounded her for her beliefs and her chosen life. Her father disowned her and cut Isabel off from her sisters. In the end, it proved a blow too powerful to sustain. For all we accomplished, for all we had together, she knew it would never win back her place among her own kind, and, in an oblique way, her entire life had been lived toward that unattainable goal. When she ended it, she left me a final letter that simply said, "What would the weight of the world turned against me matter had I won over the lone voice whose hatred cuts the deepest? I cannot live without that which has been obliterated. Farewell." "Do you believe burial on holy ground will soothe Isabel's dissatisfied soul?" asked Albert. Le Chardonnier nodded. "Perhaps. She never lost hold of her upbringing, but perhaps it is no more than foolish superstition. I called Brother Garamond's disappearance a tragedy because his situation was not unlike that of your beloved," said Albert. "What little Garamond spoke of his family made it clear he had joined our order as a last resort. His father demanded a son better attuned to the sword and more likely to provide suitable heirs for the family name, one like his two brothers before him, and when this proved not to be, he turned his last son away as a stranger. Deeply troubled, Garamond lost himself among the libertines of Vion's underworld, but eventually his soul revolted. He craved redemption. He wished no more than to heal the wound that daily assailed him. Had he lived, perhaps he might have. I shall pray for Isabel, and for you, as I have prayed for Garamond." "Do as you will," said the mage. "Our watch is over, and I wish to rest." How long Le Chardonnier lay lapsed in fitful unconsciousness he could not estimate. He awoke to Brother Albert's hand upon his shoulder and the dying echo of an awful scream lingering in his ears. Fear coursed through him like poison. His lungs heaved for air. "Luke, you are safe! We are camped on the high road along the Issoile," Albert stated. "You were beset by night terrors. You have trembled all night like a man whose conscience suffers. What is it that bedevils you?" "I screamed?" asked Le Chardonnier. Albert nodded. "Then the better question to ask is what bedevils us both. For if I called aloud, why hasn't our brave escort attended us?" Albert and Le Chardonnier peered through the slight opening of the shelter. The darkness rendered no secrets. Only the barest pale glow of their fire remained. The snow had ceased, and all around them stretched a crystalline void. "Giraud?" the mage called out. Silence reigned for a scant few moments before response came in a tremendous pounding from the west. The ground shook with unnatural tremors. A ghastly peal of laughter thundered across the sky, turning the two men's stomachs to knots. They leapt to their feet, shocked to action by the realization that they stood alone and defenseless against an unseen power. The dreadful thumping of the massive unknown thing grew closer. Le Chardonnier fled shelter with Albert behind him, but both men succumbed to a fresh wave of dread at the sight of what awaited them beyond the campfire. There lay two of the men-at-arms, their bodies smashed and crumpled like discarded parchment, their figures mangled and embedded into the snow and earth, blood and organic matter splashed around them within the perimeter of the shallow crater in which they rested. Realizing that the position of the shelter at the back of the cove had kept it hidden in shadow, Le Chardonnier surmised that the hulking abomination whose approach pounded through the night like a landslide had been recalled by his cry in the stillness. He scooped armfuls of snow and dirt onto the fire, smothering it until the sputtering flames sizzled and died, sending forth a diaphanous column of gray smoke. Without waiting for the final coal to fade, the mage dragged Brother Albert toward the road, hoping to hide amidst the snowdrifts and tangled dead wood on the far slope. A burst of terrible cackling reverberated through the night, laughter like 1,000 mad voices choking in convulsions of absurdity, shrieks like the demon-tainted spirits of a host of slaughtered innocents. The sound burrowed into their minds with fetid tendrils of fear that devoured rational thought and left only panic in its place. Blind, all-encompassing horror overwhelmed their beings and threatened to consume them. Le Chardonnier struggled against the invasion, demanding the full extent of his arcane prowess to erect a fragile shield against the raw, undiluted insanity that imperiled him. Brother Albert had no such resources. He crumpled to the ground, whimpering and terrified, curled into a ball, and clamped his hands over his ears in a futile gesture. The mage grabbed hold and dragged the incoherent monk from the road, but his strength was fading and the dead weight proved too great until abruptly the burden lightened and both men tumbled off the edge of the road into the deep culvert. Before Le Chardonnier could orient himself, Marshal Giraud clamped a hand around his mouth and revealed his presence. With him was the third man-at-arms. It was they who had helped carry Brother Albert to safety. The explosive footsteps crashed all around, and the land quivered with their weight. A heavy, unclean stench permeated the air, and, though the abyssal darkness left him quite blind, Le Chardonnier sensed an immense presence towering above them, lingering, sniffing the air, hunting. He caught an unwelcome glimpse of its dead, glazed eyes reflecting a stray beam of moonlight high above, farther up than the tallest spire of the Cathedral of Vionne. The beast hesitated, waiting, seeking some sign of the noise that had recalled it to the campsite. Finding none, it soon shifted and resumed its retreat, marching through the heavy woodland toward the heart of Nathair's plain. When its bombastic footsteps faded, the marshal released Le Chardonnier's mouth. Giraud grabbed the wizard by the arms. "No earthly thing so massive could be so stealthy," he blurted. "It came upon us without warning. Truly we faced some pit-spewed demon. Jean and I were standing by the road when it came, but the others, by the fire they had no chance. It smashed them with but a blow." Giraud clasped his head and turned away as if to hide the unfettered emotion dancing across his face. "My God, Le Chardonnier, what is it?" The mage slid a small brass container from his pocket and unclasped the lid. A faint glimmer emerged as he opened it, and he held the light up to Brother Albert's mud-caked face. The monk remained enraptured with terror, his mind lost to the world, driven from reason by fear. At that moment the demonic beast unleashed a last inhuman shriek that reached them across the expanse of bare treetops and shook their convictions. "Will he recover?" Giraud asked. "Somewhat, but he'll never be the man he was. For one so young to be so enfeebled is truly a loss," answered Le Chardonnier. "But I know of none who succumbed to the mad cries and laughter of Le Revenant, and later regained their faculties. Yet 3 of us weathered the assault with our minds intact. I possess defenses against such dangers, but why you and Jean were spared I do not know." "Jean is deaf," said Giraud. "As for me, who can say? But you call this thing a revenant. You tell me it is a ghost?" "Not a ghost. It's a necromantic monstrosity, vengeance given form through the most black-hearted of spells. It is the rotten flesh of the dead infused with vicious new life. Such is the creation of thrice great Nathair, who sought to revenge himself against the people of Vionne in 1281. Derided for his hideousness and small stature, Nathair knit a patchwork giant from the bodies of the dead with which to terrorize Averoigne. Only his former pupil, Gaspard du Nord, stopped him, but once raised, a revenant cannot be destroyed for 100 years. The beast has lain fallow beneath Nathair's plain, waiting some new soul with a fresh thirst for vengeance to revive it." "Then Nathair has returned?" asked Giraud. "Nathair's festering soul and flesh remain forever a part of the Revenant, but it is not his will that guides it. A new call for evil has arisen," said Le Chardonnier. "How can you be certain? Nathair was a powerful necromancer." "I am certain because before we left my home last morning I summoned Nathair's soul from the hell in which it abides and asked it," Le Chardonnier said. Giraud recoiled at his memory of the otherworldly voices he had heard in the mage's dwelling. His stony face trembled with disgust. "In the morning we must find the Revenant and put it to its final end." "Have you not listened to me?" argued Le Chardonnier. "The year is 1379. Nether's abomination is but 97 years old. It cannot be destroyed for another 3 years, and even then the task presses the impossible." "But it has been stopped before." "Yes, after a fashion, put to sleep by Dunord," Le Chardonnier confirmed. "That option, however, is no longer open to us. The powder Dunord used was of Nether's own devising, and knowledge of its manufacture died with him. Nether's spirit refused to grant me the knowledge. Our best chance will be to slay the one whose wish for vengeance awoke the thing and drives it."
"Then we shall go to Nether's plain and carry out an execution."
Le Chardonnier said nothing. What would be by daylight would be. He comforted himself with thoughts of Isabel and the prospect of her happiness wherever she had gone upon leaving him. If his deeds on the morrow could secure peace for his beloved, then he would willingly let slip his mortal frame to accomplish it. The next day began in dispute. Sunlight pried through the cloud cover. Narrow patches of blue sky lay exposed, but the horizon's persistent darkness signaled that the respite would be short-lived. Le Chardonnier woke to Giraud and Jean, arguing while they had buried their fallen comrades. The lack of ceremony or rites to accompany the interment upset Jean, and Giraud criticized him for his sentiment. Tempers flared again when the marshal demanded that they leave Brother Albert behind so that they might face Nether's revenant unencumbered. But Le Chardonnier, who had developed an unexpected affection for the monk, refused. In the end, they strapped the mindless cleric into his saddle and let Le Chardonnier lead his horse by rope. Thus they entered the wild desolation of Nether's plain. The putrescent energy of the place sickened them and sapped their willpower. All around stood nothing but long-dead vegetation speckled by fresh growth and fetid matter too abhorrent to consider. Like rotten wood beneath its bark, the snow-encrusted earth gave softly under the weight of the horses' hooves. The air became laden with the moist slickness of oil and fat, and with each step the grotesque setting worked its vile notions into the cracks of their minds, drowning their moods in a tide of futility. Le Chardonnier tried to guide the others to protect their thoughts and block out the deathly illness that intruded upon them. It was all that stood between them and utter despair, and in a subtle manner, Giraud fell back so that the mage became their leader. They were now beyond any territory the marshal felt competent to chart. By the river's edge, the stench reached unimaginable intensity. Brother Albert, who seemed slightly more aware of his existence than he had that morning, vomited upon himself several times when confronted with the noxious fumes. The others gagged back the bile that rose within them. They traversed the majority of the plain without incident. The sky darkened once more with the renewed threat of snow. Weary of the stillness, Le Chardonnier gathered them in a circle. "Something is amiss," he said. "We should have encountered the revenant by now."
"Could it have fled?"
asked Giraud. "From us? Don't be ridiculous," answered the mage. "Perhaps it is hunting along the road." Le Chardonnier, with his back to the river 30 feet away, reacted not to the sudden torrent of water that fountained upward, but to Jean, whose face paled with shock as he drew his blade. Giraud immediately followed, urging the mage to order his horse around to face the river. Their quarry had approached beneath the oily surface and erupted forth, casting toxic sludge in all directions and forcing the scum-coated water crashing over the bank. The creature surpassed nightmares, a towering, decomposed homunculus lashed together from the flesh and bone of hundreds of dead men, a gigantic receptacle for hatred and rage so fiery that even the worm-riddled clay of the giant threatened to rupture from containing it. Its face burned with an eldritch aura, a death mask caricature of the long-dead necromancer who had crafted it. Ropey tangles of obsidian hair flailed about its skull like eels. Clinging to the abomination's back were the remnants of a massive basket strapped between its shoulders. Dangling there, with limbs and bones embedded in the revenant's gelatinous skin, were the squirming forms of Nether's 10 pupils. Among them, an 11th figure, one still human and living, clung to his footing at the base of the undead titan's neck. The revenant arched its back, dropped wide its crooked jawbone, and screeched to drown out the wind. Like the foul, feral grunts of pleasure uttered by the satyr's consort, like the howling of witches burned alive for their ungodly ways, like the whisper of skin flayed from living muscle magnified 1,000,000 times, the voice crushed the riders' souls. Even Jean, who could not hear the dreadful wail, reacted as the raw waves of sound rippled through him. He fell from his mount in unfettered panic. The assault threatened to splinter Les Chaudronniere's defenses. He looked to the others. Giraud contorted in agony, but somehow clung to his wits. Brother Albert, unfazed in his madness, giggled like a child, gazed upwards, and waved to the dark figure atop the revenant. Albert's mouth moved, but his words died in the discordant echo of the revenant's undead song. Le Chaudronniere dropped from his horse. Familiar black shapes swam around him, indigo silhouettes that circled like wanton sharks, and an oft-tasted dread welled inside him, the black thoughts of his subconscious drawn forth by the revenant's summons. Already the riders were incapacitated. The mage saw no chance of survival, but Brother Albert's actions resounded with his intuition. In the monk's senseless gesticulations and yelling lay some piece of the puzzle, and, though oblivion loomed mere seconds away, he refused to let go of any small hope. Le Chaudronniere grabbed Albert's cloak and yanked him downward to his ear. The howl of the revenant dipped in a lull, and the mage picked out Brother Albert's words. "Brother Garamond! Hello! Hello down here! Garamond!" The mage whirled about and peered through the gloom at the commanding shape clutching foul strands of the revenant's hair like reins. The man wore the clothing required by Brother Albert's order, the soiled and torn garb now barely recognizable. His hair was trimmed in the accompanying manner. The missing Brother Garamond had come to Nether's plain and found himself a monster. The lunatic flailed like a mad puppet and cried inaudible obscenities into the cold air. His sight fell upon Albert and Le Chaudronniere. The revenant raised its arm of withered flesh and mineralized bone. A deepening shadow engulfed the two men upon the riverbank. Seconds passed, but the crushing weight did not fall. Le Chaudronniere, who had turned away from his imminent doom, coiled around in time to see the limp figure of Brother Garamond drop like a stone into the ebon waters of the Isawil. A long shaft protruded from his torso. The revenant stood frozen in place, the tatters of its being fluttering in the wind. A hateful grimace locked on its face. Its eyes simmered with cold anger. Still atop his mount, Giraud seized a fresh bolt from the quiver at his side and reloaded his crossbow. His chest heaved with exertion. "It is done," he cried, but Le Chaudronniere could see that the revenant yet seethed, awaiting a new command. Brother Garamond had only been wounded. He gathered Albert and fled from the prone giant, helping Jean to his feet as well, and leading them to rejoin the marshal. The deaf man refused to take his place by Giraud's side. He unbuckled his sword belt and threw it to the ground at the feet of his leader's mount. He spat and barked words malformed by his passion, his meaning beyond Le Chaudronniere's grasp. Giraud turned his cold eyes towards the man and shrugged. "Then so be it, idiot," the marshal said. "I trusted you with my life, yet you cast off my loyalty." Giraud turned his crossbow toward Jean's chest. The tortured man-at-arms punched himself and screamed more words that only Giraud understood. Le Chaudronniere thrust himself between the two men. "Enough!" he bellowed. "Settle your petty bickering later. Your bolt has bought us but a brief reprieve, Giraud. Brother Garamond yet lives, and so the Revenant. We must stand together." "That is the matter at hand, Messire le Charbonnier," Giraud said. "Jean has renounced my leadership, for he does not approve of how I have treated my son." The troubled Le Charbonnier searched Jean's tear-streaked face. Rage, heated and righteous, burned there. The deaf man pointed to the place in the river where Brother Garamond had slipped beneath the surface, then gestured to Giraud, croaking again in speech only the Marshal could decipher for his years of friendship with his soldier. "Garamond? Your son?" breathed Le Charbonnier. "Jean thinks I drove him beyond reason with abuse and torture. He says I brought this renewed evil upon all of Averoigne," Giraud said. "He calls me inhuman because I did not pause to mourn those sons I lost in the night, Garamond's brothers, and for his insolence he must die. Now stand aside, devil worshipper." Le Charbonnier enjoyed no time in which to make his choice. The crumbling roots of a long-dead, uprooted pine crashed among them, hurtling him to his back. Jean disappeared amidst the tangle of old wood, and Albert fell into the mud. The heavy base of the trunk collided with Giraud and projected him from his saddle with brutal force. His mount toppled sideways onto him. The Revenant screamed, and the whole of the dark plain quaked with the awful cacophony. Brother Garamond dragged himself free of the river muck and stalked along the bank. Nathair's necrotic giant followed him. Twisting its powerful, unnatural muscles, it hurled the tree into the distance and then crouched behind Garamond, who had knelt beside his father. The lunatic monk chortled and grasped, probing his father's broken body, touching and prodding, caressing, testing the extent of his progenitor's wounds. He leapt to his feet and danced in circles, hopping from one foot to the next, unleashing discordant guffaws of pleasure, gyrating and bouncing with his sinister glee unleashed. With a sudden move, he dropped to all fours and spat in his father's face. Giraud struggled to breathe. Blood soaked through his tunic, but the terrible hardness in his eyes had not faded. He stared at his son like a cat might survey a plump insect. When Garamond next crouched beside his mortally wounded patriarch, Giraud seized the boy by the neck and thrust the broken shaft of a crossbow bolt through his throat. Vermilion poured forth, and Garamond's noxious joy turned to choking gasps. The Marshal snapped his wrist, wrenching the arrowhead deeper, and then Garamond fell lifeless across his father's figure, his last breath gushing out of him. The Revenant remained, alert, the horrible glow still alight in its eyes. Fresh laughter cut through the afternoon. The towering charnel golem crouched until its hideous, leering face hung inches from Le Charbonnier. Giraud struggled to raise himself on his elbows. "You, sorceress, brought this to us. You claimed my last son," uttered the Marshal. "Now you pay." The Revenant swayed and thrust to its full height. It lingered for a moment, gazing downward, before it raised its horrendously thick leg and poised its foot above the head of the weary mage. But once more, something stayed its blow. In a heartbeat, all life fled from the dread creation, and it crumpled backwards, plummeting into the thick waters of the Issoile, roiling foulness in every direction, until the black waters flowed back to embrace it and claim it as their own. Le Charbonnier looked to Giraud. The Marshal lay dead with Jean's dagger embedded in his heart. His lust for vengeance extinguished, Jean and Le Charbonnier gathered the two surviving mounts, placed Albert in the saddle of one, and then fled Nathair's plain for the cold comfort of the empty road and the heavy slate sky. Some weeks later, Le Charbonnier stood beside the freshly filled grave of Isabelle Eichmann, now interred on the grounds of the Cathedral of Vion. Sunlight came down in welcome pillars through the hazy morning. A single priest presided over the burial. The Archbishop had refused Le Charbonnier an audience, but the mage had delivered his report through intermediaries who had also brought word of its acceptance. Brother Albert was returned to his monastery and the care of his order. Henri Giraud's remains were left to rot beside those of his son on the lifeless riverbank where both had fallen. It had been Giraud's own secret wishes for vengeance that had shielded him from the madness of the Revenant, and so the plain made a fitting grave, thought Le Charbonnier. Of Jean, nothing was known. He left Villon within a day of their arrival and said nothing of his destination. Le Charbonnier passed the bright morning alone by the new grave of his beloved before undertaking the long journey home to his solitude. Whether Isabelle would now know peace, Le Charbonnier could never discover, but that night his dread visions tormented him still, and he felt certain in his bones that the blackness would haunt him for many nights to come, a revenant of sorts that was all his own. The end. I enjoyed the more kind of subtle setup that this story had. There is a theme of parents not accepting or even worse, outright rejecting the lives and choices of their young ones and what consequences that might have for the lives of all involved. I didn't catch it the first time that I read this story, and going through again for the channel, I thought it was subtly built to in an interesting way. I appreciate this, obviously, as a sequel to the Colossus of Yulorn, but also as a tragic and thematic addition to what makes the Averoigne tales so special. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you enjoyed this work, you're probably the kind of person that would like thrilling suspense fantasy. So check out the link in the description to get your hands on some of my work, and I will see you in the next video. Also, like, comment, subscribe. All right, now I'm really out. Take care.